I was adopted nearly from birth, and like many adoptees for years, I dreamed of being able to meet my birth mother. My search began on my 18th birthday, and I was shocked to have been told on that day that that door was closed, that I would never have the opportunity to meet her. And it was very difficult for me. All these years, I just had this expectation. It was my information. So I went ahead and I petitioned for what's called my non-identifying information. And when it arrived, it had everything you can imagine about my birth mother except for her name. It had her eye color, hair color, height, weight, age, the age of my half-brother and half-sister who were 11 and 13 when I was born, her ethnicity, religious background, occupation, educational level, detailed medical history. And I just hung on to every word. But then for my father, it said that he was Caucasian and of large build. And that was it. And of course, I thought, that sounds like a police description. I mean, come on, she couldn't even say his eye color, hair color, nothing. I thought it over. I mean, what could the possible explanation be? I called up my caseworker and asked her, was my mom raped? And she said, yeah, I didn't want to tell you. And I was just devastated. I remember feeling so ugly and unwanted, thinking, who would ever love me? Who's ever going to want to marry me? Because the explanation for my adoptive brother, who had been in and out of jail and prison from 15, was that socially deviant behavior is genetic. Oh, so what does that mean about who I am? Do I have this ugliness lurking inside of me? If I would give birth to a son someday, would he become a rapist? And I really believed that a nice guy would want to get involved with someone like me. And then, of course, at the same time, I thought about the issue of abortion, because that's what you always hear about. Growing up, abortion wasn't talked about a whole lot in my family. When I was 12, my 16-year-old cousin had one, and I recall the discussions being that this was not a good thing. In high school, I remember studying this issue, where I went to public school, and seeing photos of aborted babies and being horrified. But I didn't identify with that. I didn't look at the pictures and think, oh, that could have been me. No, I thought it was just some sad story where she couldn't afford to keep me, but abortion doesn't apply to my life, I thought. Then when I was 14, a year after my grandfather died, it was like the floodgates had opened. And for years, my grandmother would share this story that when she was pregnant with my aunt, who's the younger of her two children, that my grandfather had told her to go get an abortion. And she said, I never loved him again after that. How could they do that? How could they kill the babies? She'd say over and over again for years. And so I learned from her that, okay, so this is definitely a bad thing. I mean, I now had a face to the issue. That was my aunt who I adored. I couldn't imagine. But I figured, I just won't have one. Beyond that, it didn't affect my life, so I didn't give it much more thought. Then I turn 18, I get this information, and all of a sudden, it has to do with my very survival. And it was as if I could hear the echoes of all those people who would say, I'm pro-life. Well, except in cases of rape. Huh? Or I'm pro-choice. Oh, especially in cases of rape. And now I realize that all those people were talking about me, about my life, and I felt like I had at least half the world against me. That there's all these people out there who don't even know me, who are standing in judgment of my life, so quick to dismiss it just because of how I was conceived. And I felt like I was now going to have to justify my own existence, that I would have to prove myself to the world that I shouldn't have been aborted and that I was worthy of living. I spoke at a great homeschool convention in several of them this spring, but I spoke at one just a few weeks ago in Cincinnati. And a few days later, I received an email from a father who had attended the conference with his family. And he told me that he was a prosecutor in Ohio, and let me tell you, he was definitely my prosecutor, because he proceeded to tell me how he was. He said, don't get me wrong, I think abortion's bad, I think it's immoral, but he said, I just think in cases of rape, it should be okay. And they started to say to me, oh, and your premise hasn't considered the fact that even if the embryo had been destroyed, that you couldn't have been here. And then he started to talk about like spirit child, and that who's to say God couldn't have put you in a different body later. And I'm like, this sounds like a reincarnation. What is he talking about? And then other people started to later say to me that when I took his comments and put it on Facebook, people said, this is Mormon theology right here. Like, wow, okay, well, he's definitely rationalizing this for himself. We would certainly never say to anyone else, you would never say to any of your classmates that, oh, God's plans can't be thwarted. So if you're murdered or killed by a drunk driver or something, who's to say God wouldn't put you in another body later? I mean, it's just stupidity. You would never say that to somebody. But here I was, again, in a position that I knew when I was 18 that I would be in. I put myself out there. I'm going to have to justify my existence to people. And then it was a few months ago, I received an email from a young woman who said, somebody showed me your website, and I've been reading through things, and I'm just having a really hard time with this whole issue of rape and abortion cases of rape. She says, I don't mean to offend you or anything, but do you mind if I ask you some questions? And then she started to ask me, can you please tell me, what have you done with your life to justify you being alive after your mother was raped? Like, for example, I would like to know, what kind of things do you do to volunteer in the community? Like, what good have you done in your life? Because I'm just having a hard time, dealing with this. And she's like, I hope you don't mind me asking that. Wow, I mean, this is what I knew when I was 18. I'm literally having to sit there and defend my own existence. Now, today, I know my worth, and I know that I shouldn't have to, but I went ahead and I went through that process with her of, telling her what God's done in my life. I don't believe that my value is based upon any of that. Don't get me wrong. I absolutely believe that I have an infinite worth like any of you, and that our value is not based upon our successes or our failures in life or what we do with our lives, or your abilities or disabilities, but you all have an infinite worth that Christ paid on the cross for each one of us. But I went through the process, and at the end of several emails back and forth of me proving my worth to her, she finally said, I get it. She's like, I appreciate you taking the time with me. I'm sorry I put you through all of that. She's like, but I fully recognize that you're valuable, and I just had a talk with my parents, and I told them about how I feel about this issue, and I'm really passionate about it, and I want to know how I can get involved and help. Wow, okay, that was a good ending. But it's tough. How many of you get emails like that where, or where you have to sit there and justify your worth? Do you have to do that? I have to do that all the time. And it stinks. And then one of the things I did was I looked in the yellow pages when I was 18 under right to life. It was a phrase I had once heard. And I called a local right to life office in Michigan because I just wanted to speak to someone who valued my life. And then I asked my adoptive parents, well, how do you feel about abortion? And what about in cases of rape? And my adoptive father started to say, well, I've always felt like, who am I to say what a woman can or cannot do with her own body? I guess I'd have to say I've always been pro-choice. Wow, Dad, you really believe that? You really mean to say that my birth mother's body, her choice for the 8 months from the time she found out that she was pregnant with me, that was more important than my whole entire existence? Like, you raised me 18 years. Like, you really believe that, Dad? Like, really? And it was like he instantly snapped out of it. No, I don't believe that. wow, how would I ever get to a point where I would believe such a thing? And they started to talk about how, as a professor on a liberal college campus, that it was just expected that if you were progressive-minded, you would be pro-choice. But he had never stopped to consider the ramifications of that position, particularly as an adoptive father. And so I learned at a minimum at 18 that my story had the potential to change hearts and minds, but I still struggled with issues of value, identity, and worth. You know, the big picture questions: who am I? Why am I here? What is my worth? I ended up settling in relationships, like I should be thankful that somebody would want to be with somebody like me. I jumped into relationships. So if after a short amount of time and a few intense conversations, a guy was telling me to cancel my plans with my family or friends and saying, "Come see me, I just want to be with you, I miss you." Like, wow, that sounded so good at the time, but I realized that over time, I was allowing myself to become more and more alienated from my family and friends, isolated and dependent upon him for my emotional well-being. And those controlling relationships became more and more abusive, until eventually I was beat up by a boyfriend from law school. He broke my jaw. My front tooth was hanging. I had to have all kinds of surgery to have it put back in, root canals to try to save it. I was told I could still end up losing my front tooth someday. And after 13 years, I had to have it pulled, which was devastating. But I was speaking at a pregnancy center fundraiser in Alabama, and an expert in cosmetic dentistry came up to me afterwards and offered to do all of my teeth for free as part of the Give Back a Smile program for victims of domestic violence. And he didn't just do 3 with a bridge and 4th to match, but 8 teeth with porcelain veneers. So, and I share that story with you because it's another example in my life where there was something that happened that was really, really awful. But then something beautiful came out of it. And isn't that what God is famous for? The worst evil that man has in store, God can take and use it for good. It's the story of Joseph in Egypt when his brothers sold him into slavery. It said that man intended this for harm, but God has used it for good, and it is the story of our Savior. And the story does not have to end with the violence having victory. But as it says in Scripture, God trades beauty for ashes. Well, I'm very thankful for this nice new set of teeth, but let me make one thing clear. That does not make me pro-domestic violence. Right? Just like being thankful for my life does not make me pro-rape. But people actually say that to me, especially on university campuses during the question and answer period. They'll say, "Oh, so what you're saying is that if abortion had been legal, you wouldn't be here today." Well, if your birth mother hadn't been raped, you wouldn't be here today either. So does that mean you're pro-rape? People actually say that to me. And I explain to them that there's a huge moral difference because I did exist and my life would have been ended because I would have been killed through a brutal abortion. I may not look the same as I did when I was 4 years old or 4 days old, yet unborn in my mother's womb, but that was still undeniably me, and I would have been killed. That's a huge moral difference. And then in response, I have people say, "Yeah, but that wouldn't have been you." Well, then who would it have been? Well, it just wouldn't have been you yet. Okay, so let me ask you guys, how many of you in your baby albums at home have ultrasound photos? Maybe you haven't looked in a while. My 3 youngest kids certainly do. My 2 oldest are adopted, but my 3 daughters, they have their ultrasound photos. And what would your parents say to you? Do they say, I don't really know what that is. Like, I don't know. It's like some kind of glob of tissue. Like, I don't even know what it's doing in there. No. What do your parents say to you? They say, that was... And everywhere I go, students finish the sentence. You understand, that was me. And one day when you have children, you can show them pictures. That was mommy or that was daddy. When they have, you can show them their own ultrasound photos. That was you. And then when you have other children, you bring the siblings into the ultrasound like I did with my children. Brought them all to the ultrasound. And that's your brother, that's your sister. And when they're born, they remember that I saw you when you were in mommy's belly. They understand it. They get it. But then, and they see the causal connection, everything. But then somehow, when it comes to this issue of abortion, some of those same people would say, well, that wasn't you. Or, I don't know what that is. And it is complete intellectual dishonesty. Well, at the time I had been beat up, I had really hit rock bottom. From all outward appearances, I had so much going for me. I excelled in academics and athletics. I was attending a great law school. But I was totally deteriorating on the inside over this whole issue of value. And that is when Christ called me back to him. Now, the first time I'd ever heard the message of the gospel, I was 15. I was adopted and raised in a Jewish household. And trust me, Jesus is not a popular subject in a Jewish family. And I had a friend who invited me to hear a special youth speaker who laid out the message of the gospel. Now, not to spoil it for any of you, but growing up, I had seen all the movies and sung all the songs, how Santa went to all the houses of all the good little boys and girls around the world. But Santa didn't come to my house. And when I tried to ask my parents about it, they would just say, well, it's because we're Jewish. Well, I grew up learning about the Nazis, and they killed all these Jews, including many of our family members, and apparently Santa Claus didn't like Jewish kids either. And then when I was invited to go to Mass with a friend who never shared her faith with me, all I was told was, I didn't understand why I couldn't go up and have crackers and juice with everyone else, because she didn't share her faith. And she said, well, it's because you're Jewish. Well, so I thought, well, apparently in church, they don't like Jews either. And so it took finally another friend who invited me back, who shared her faith with me, and this youth speaker who explained the message of the gospel. Now, I share that with you because many people, you look at who you can share your faith with. Sometimes people think, well, I'll just share it with a Lutheran because, I just need to make sure they understand, like, the Eucharist, and why they should be, in the Catholic Church, and that's kind of like, easy evangelism, right? But you don't see other people as being on your radar for being lost and in need of hearing of your faith. And they think like, oh, Muslim kids, Jewish kids, Hindu, or, maybe your average atheist, are sort of off limits because how do I even begin to share my faith with them? I encourage you, don't be afraid to share your faith or even just invite them. But then if you do invite them to Mass with you, share your faith. Well, so I believed that night, but then after 9 months, I no longer had a ride. My Jewish parents were not about to drive me. I felt forsaken by my church friends, and I ended up spending some of the toughest years of my life away from God, away from church, doing things my way and the world's way, until he called me back. And once again, it was another friend who invited me to Mass. And I remember they sang the song Amazing Grace, and I just broke down crying because I was no longer dealing with just what had been done to me in my life, but now I was dealing with the consequences of my own decisions and how I had harmed myself. And then I asked, then I ended up in RCIA, and I remember when I went through RCIA, to become a Catholic, the first scripture we were given about how you enter the family, of believers, was that it is in the spirit of adoption that we're all called to be God's children through Christ. And that was revolutionary for me. To hear that adoption is not second best, last resort only for the infertile. Why would you want to adopt if you don't have to? But that it was God's first choice and meant for the body of Christ. And that's why my husband and I chose to adopt first, not knowing we would actually experience 4 years of infertility. Let me take you back to when I was 18 and I first learned how I was conceived. Of course, at that point, I thought about my birth mother, and I thought she must hate me. This has absolutely got to be the worst thing that's ever happened to her in her life. She's never going to want to meet me. She probably wanted to abort me. But then again, after a while, I had it all worked out in my head that maybe there was some mistake, or if I could find that this was not how I was conceived, I could feel good about myself and I could feel safe. I wouldn't have to still feel like I was a target. I didn't want to be part of that classification, conceived in rape. Who would? So I ended up being one of the first people in Michigan to have a judge allow my caseworker to try to contact my birth mother and see if she wanted to meet me. And it worked. I was attending college out of state at the time. I finally received a letter with my birth name, which was Judy Ann Miracle. So I was a miracle baby. I thought that was kind of cool. And then I called her, trembling. She said that she was sorry to hear that I already knew. And then she proceeded to fill me in on some horrific details that I was totally unequipped to hear. She's 4'10". She weighed 90 pounds, really petite. A single mom heading to the grocery store at night right down the street from her home. The guy jumped out of the bushes with a knife, abducted her, and basically she went on to describe for me in graphic detail how he brutally raped her. And that's how I was conceived. And that was so hard to hear for several reasons. First of all, to think that I was conceived out of a truly worst case scenario, I just felt totally worthless. Like garbage. Because of people who would say that my life was like garbage, that I was disposable. And then I had to realize that my biological father was a really bad man. She said she had gone to several police lineups and stopped going because she wouldn't recognize his face, but they knew that this was a serial rapist. And then all these years, I had really dreamed so much of meeting her. I had written poetry about meeting her. And so to hear that she had been violated like this really pained me. We arranged for me to fly home and meet her on her 51st birth date. In the meantime, she sent me photos and a letter. And she wrote, "My dearest Rebecca, hoping by now that the shock of finding out all the details of your birth are forgotten. For that was not reason enough of having to give up something as beautiful as you were. Nothing as precious as a baby. Mostly when you go through the 9 months and the birth all alone, feeling like no one loves you. But you were so perfect and pretty. All these years I had nothing of you, nothing saying you were part of me. Just the memory of carrying a baby that I hoped one day would try to find her real mother, as I always wanted to know my baby. You were always with me in my thoughts. You were always with me in my heart, mostly in July. It seems like a lifetime, I know. When I was sick 2 years ago, I thought I would never get to know my little girl. Would you please even get me a copy of the letter you sent to the Oakland County judge? It made me cry. Also, I would like copies of your poems. These are things I would like to read. It's been a long 3 weeks. Looking forward to our meeting. I didn't know how to express my inner feelings." And she put in caps, It's so great, big, beautiful. It's always been my dream. I am so happy. I'm crying. And she put in closing, a love that aided me for 19 years, my daughter at last. With love, your mom, Joanne. Wow, that was just all my dreams come true. I felt so affirmed, and I felt like, yes, I was wanted. I flew home, had a wonderful reunion weekend with her. The next day, she had a huge family reunion for me. I got to meet my half-brother, which was really weird to think we could have grown up together. Today, he calls me or texts me every single day. We're really close. Our children are the closest cousins that they have. And then 6 years later, I met my half-sister when I flew down to Florida for a 5-generation photo. It was the 4th time in a row that they had 5 generations of women alive. I got to room with my grandmother at the time, which was so cool. But after this initial reunion weekend, I flew back to college, went to a few meetings of Collegians for Life. I didn't get involved at that point because I didn't feel like I fit in anywhere. I was making horrible choices in my life. But it gave me the courage and support I felt I needed to finally call my birth mother and ask her about abortion, because I still needed to know. And she told me that if abortion had been legal in Michigan at the time, that she would have aborted me. And I asked, well, you don't mean if you had to do it all over again, right? And she said, no. Well, what about everything you said in that letter? Not reason enough? What about when you told me that when you were sick 2 years ago, that the only thing that kept you going was the hope that someday you'd be able to meet me? What about that? You wouldn't have had that. And her response was just, you don't know what it was like. And I know that that's true. But I also know that today, she's okay. She actually just called me before I came in here. She's doing great. She has a wonderful husband, a beautiful home, and despite the utter horror of her saying that to me, I still chose to nurture a relationship with her, to honor her for the role that she did play in my life. And frankly, I just hoped that if I could prove myself good enough, that she'd change her mind. Well, by the time she did change her mind about abortion, 6 years later, I was at a really good place in my life, now knowing my value, identity, and purpose in Christ, where I no longer needed to hear that from my own well-being, but it was still great to hear. I was with her when she was making baby clothes for my niece in Florida, who was in an unplanned pregnancy with her first great-grandchild. And she said, I'm so glad she's having this baby. And I've changed my mind about all of that. 2 days later, Norma McCorvey, who's Jane Roe from Roe versus Wade, announced the very same thing to the nation. Roe versus Wade is the U.S. Supreme Court decision that legalized abortion across the U.S. She announced that she had changed her mind about abortion after years of having worked in an abortion clinic and having been a pro-choice activist, yet never actually having had an abortion herself. You see, by the time her case reached the United States Supreme Court, she had already given birth and placed that child for adoption. So how nice that she can do that, change her mind about abortion, and still have the opportunity to enjoy a relationship with her child from that case. What about the millions of women since for whom changing their mind is the very painful realization that they will never have that opportunity here on earth, many of whom are my dear friends. How many of you had heard the name Norma McCorvey, Jane Roe before? You knew about Roe v. Wade. So how many of you know whether or not she had a son or a daughter? Most pro-life activists don't even know. She had a daughter. This was not some fictitious, theoretical, philosophical, legal entity that they call a fetus, but a real person, and a woman no less, who is walking the face of this earth, who was targeted for abortion in that case. Don't ever let people forget that we are talking about real people, especially in the case of Roe v. Wade, especially in abortion clinics and pregnancy centers. When this issue comes up in college, you make sure you remind your professors, you remind your classmates, she had a daughter. One of my pet peeves in the pro-life movement is when people say, it's a child, not a choice. No, he or she is a child, not a choice. They have a gender. I represented the mother in Michigan's frozen embryo case. One cell, 5 of them, their lives were suspended in liquid nitrogen tanks. My client, their mother, wanted to give them the opportunity to be born, to have them thawed and transferred to her womb so she could give birth to them. She had a 3-year-old son at the time who was conceived in the same grouping of 5. She would look at his face every day and understand that he could easily have been one of the 5. This is not a fictitious, theoretical, philosophical exercise for her, but very tangible. And she wants her children to be born. And the father wanted them to be destroyed. Well, the doctors testified in deposition that from one cell, they are living human beings. They're very much alive. That is embryology 101. And they have a gender, and ascertainably so. They could look under a microscope and determine which ones are male and which ones are female. And to help you remember this, it's just like it says in the book of Genesis, that in the beginning, God created them. Male and female, he created them. And right from the beginning of our creation, God creates each one of us with our gender, male or female. So anytime you can stop and use terms of gender, that further serves to humanize those children. So even better than saying the unborn child or the baby, when you can say sons or daughters, brothers and sisters, it gets people's attention, and they can ask you, why do you talk like that? And you have a chance to explain the science to them. They have a gender and share their humanity. Well, this issue will come up quite a bit in law school. I'd raise my hand in a classroom of a couple hundred students, share a little bit about my story, and explain to them the truth that whenever you identify yourself as being pro-choice, or when you make that exception for rape, that what that really translates into is you being able to stand before me, look me in the eyes, and say to me, I think that your mother should have been able to abort you. That's a pretty powerful statement. I would never say anything like that to someone. I would never say to someone, if I had my way, you'd be dead right now. But that is the reality with which I live. So describe for me how it's not, and I can tell you that it hurts. But I understand that people don't put a face to this issue. For most people, it's just a concept. With a quick cliche, they sweep under the rug and forget about it. And I do hope that my story and the dozens of other life-affirming stories on my website, on my organization's website, of those conceived in rape or incest, mothers from rape, post-abortive from rape, birth mothers from rape, that we can all help to put faces, voices, stories to this issue. Well, in response, I'd have people say to me, well, I'm not saying that I think that your mother should have aborted you. I'm just saying I think it should have been her choice. I understand that, but you need to realize that her choice was to abort me. Oh, you don't really know that. No, I do know that. How can you really know something like that? Because she told me. Well, maybe she might not have, but she said she would have. And it's like, wait a second, this thing you say you believe in, why all of a sudden standing here are you so uncomfortable that you have to create this fiction in your mind that maybe she might not have in order to try to absolve yourself of any sense of responsibility? The fact is that I am alive today. I wasn't killed because of pro-life advocates, activists, voters, leaders, legislators in Michigan who, without even knowing of my exact existence, yet recognized that mine was a life worth saving. And they did so by making sure abortion was illegal in Michigan, even in cases of rape. 100% pro-life, no exceptions, no compromise. They are my heroes. And I owe my life to them. I owe my birth to them. And that is why I, in turn, work to do the same for others. If your mother chose life for you, how nice for you. But mine didn't. She chose abortion, and pro-life activists chose life for me. And some of us are in need of heroes. Well, every now and then, again, during Q&A on university campuses, there'll be someone who would raise their hand and say, yeah, I just want to say that I have no problem looking you in the eyes and saying to you that I think that your mother should have been able to abort you, and I fully understand that that would mean that you'd be dead right now. Yeah, I just want to say I have no problem doing that. Wow, okay, well, here you go, everyone. Here's someone who, out of their care for women, that they would say such a thing to a woman like me. Can you feel the love? Because I'm not feeling it. And that's the thing, is they always talk about how much they care about women. I challenge them, hey, I'm a woman. Now tell me, what good is my right to anything as a woman if I don't have my right to life? And they can never answer that question, because all other rights are worthless if you don't have your right to life. And then I'd hear people say things like, don't you think it's extreme to force a rape victim to have to carry the rapist baby? Okay, first of all, I am not the rapist baby. I am my mother's child. I'm a child of God. And what an insult to the majority of rape victim mothers who not only choose life, but the majority of them choose to parent her child. They choose abortion at half the rate. Over 50% choose to parent, 25% choose adoption. When in your average unplanned pregnancy, 1% choose adoption. They're 25 times more likely to choose adoption. They're basically choosing adoption instead of abortion. But after everything that she's been through, you're actually going to suggest that her child is the rapist baby? What an insult. And I think it's extreme to tell another living human being that they're garbage, that they don't deserve to be living, that they weren't worthy of protection. They are the ones who are being extreme, and we need to be prepared to point that out. It's extreme to punish an innocent person for someone else's crime. That's extreme. And then in our society, we stop calling children names based upon the behavior of their parents. I was a family law attorney. We changed the law when I was practicing from being the Paternity Act to the Parentage Act, but the definition of the child was the same. Child born out of wedlock. Pretty neutral, right? Well, in the 70s, before it was the Paternity Act, it used to be called the Illegitimacy Act. And there were laws just like this all over the country. And the legal definition of a child born out of wedlock was illegitimate child. We stopped doing that because we realized how unjust it is to stigmatize and demonize a child for the behavior of their parents. Do you think that's back in the 1930s? Before it was the Illegitimacy Act, it was called the Bastard Act. And the legal definition of a child born out of wedlock was bastard. And we stopped doing that. Except for the exceptions. Except in the cases of rape, where somehow in today's society it's still perfectly acceptable to call a child a rape baby, monstrous child, demon seed, evil seed, demon spawn. Big national figures, conservative talk show hosts and pastors have called us those names. Not just pro-abortion activists have called us these horrible things, and that discrimination must not be tolerated. And then people would say to me, oh, well, if you'd been aborted, you wouldn't be here today, and you wouldn't know the difference anyway, so what does it matter? And believe it or not, the top abortion philosophers use this kind of argument that the fetus never knows what hits them, so there's no such fetus to miss their lives. Like, I guess as long as you stab someone in the back while they're sleeping, then it's okay because they don't know what hits them. If you sedate your victim before killing them, then it's okay as long as they know what hits them. So I'd explain to them how their same logic would justify me killing you today because you wouldn't be here tomorrow and you wouldn't know the difference anyway, so what does it matter? And then they just stand there with their jaws dropped like, gee, it's amazing what even just a little bit of logic can do when you really think this thing through on what we're really talking about, that there are lives who are not here today because they were aborted. It's like the old saying, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, does it make a noise? Well, if a baby is aborted and no one else is around to know about it, does that matter? And the answer is, yeah, their lives matter. My life matters. Your lives matter. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise. The world is a different place because it was illegal for my birth mother to abort me back then. Your lives are different because you're sitting here listening to me today. But I hope you know that you don't have to have an impact on the audiences for your life to matter. And there is something that we're all missing here today because of the generations now. Your generation who has been aborted, and it matters. And then worldwide we see that it is primarily females who are being aborted all over the world. In nations like China and India, for every 130 males born, there's 100 females. And what's happening is females are we're losing our voices worldwide. And because of it, we have less and less of a say in these societies. And it also contributes to sex trafficking, making things much worse. So to be pro-woman is to be pro-life. And that's an example where you can see when they're aborted, their lives matter. It's affecting all of society. The fact that they're gone, that they were killed. Well, then I'd have people, I would explain to people too that, some people say, oh, well, you were lucky. And I explain, I wasn't lucky. My birth mother went to 2 back alley abortionists, and I was almost aborted. For the first, she said it was the typical back alley conditions that you hear about as to why she should have been able to safely and legally abort me. She said there was blood and dirt on the floor and on the tables, and it was an OBGYN's office, and she just had to go in the back door. But like the same ones who are doing it today, it was filthy. And those back alley conditions and the fact that it was illegal caused her to back out, as it did with most women. And then it was arranged for her to go to a more expensive abortionist. Once again, through a rape counselor that the police had referred her to. She said there were no pregnancy resource centers back then, but if there had been, she would have gone. And this time she was to meet someone at night by the Detroit Institute of Arts. Ironically, next to the Thinker statue. Someone would approach her, say her name, blindfold her, put her in the back seat of a car, then take her and abort me, blindfold her again and drop her back off, and she was told that if there were any complications or if she was further along, that they would have to keep her overnight. And she was terrified, but she was prepared to go through with it. The night she was to abort me, my aunt was to drive her. She spoke with this abortion doctor on the phone, expressed concern for her safety. He called her stupid. She said, okay, you're going to call me names, just forget it. Well, then he went on to swear at her profusely, and she finally just hung up the phone on him. He called her back the next day to try to once again talk her into allowing him to take my life for $500. And the same conversation took place. I can't even tell you what it feels like to know that somebody wanted to take my life so badly for $500 that he would even call back the next day. You know, for some people, their near-death experience is waking up out of a coma to find out that they were almost killed in an automobile accident. And for me, this is my life-changing near-death experience. And the fact that I was younger doesn't make it any less real than someone else's near-death experience. I know the time, place, manner, how much, everything. A few years ago, I learned that the #1 film that's used in feminist studies to try to promote abortions, they talk about the back alley network. The #1 film nationwide in feminist studies is a documentary called Back Alley Detroit. I could watch that movie and see the men who were going to take my life. But again, I wasn't lucky. I was protected. Legality matters. And I'm so thankful that my life was spared. But I can't stand up here and say, oh, well, I deserved it. Look what I've done with my life. And millions of others didn't? I can't do that. Can you? Can you just sit there and say, oh, well, at least I was conceived out of 2 loving parents? At least I was wanted. At least I'm alive, or just whatever. Again, some of us are in need of heroes. Then I'd have, I was frustrated with people would say, well, I don't believe in God, I don't believe in the Bible, it's like I'm pro-choice. As if there's no other rational justification for the pro-life position. So I have a 43-page essay on my website, The Right of the Unborn Child Not to Be Unjustly Killed, a philosophy of rights approach. If you Google philosophical abortion essay, it's been ranked #1 for like the last 15 years. Lots of professors use it. I'm so glad it's getting put to good use. But I wanted to show, that everyone's accountable, that this isn't just a religious issue. This is a human rights issue. And it's easy to defend philosophically. But in the end, you can be equipped with all of the arguments, philosophical, legal, medical, scientific. It's all on our side. But in the end, we cannot let people forget that we're talking about real people. Because it's stories that pierce the heart in ways in which arguments cannot. And let me give you an example. A few years ago, I was in the film The Gift of Life with Governor Mike Huckabee. It's a Citizens United film. Mine is one of several stories featured in it. And so I've had backstage passes to the premiere in glamorous Des Moines, Iowa. It was held in between 2 presidential debates. And so I went backstage, introduced myself to the 4 presidential candidates who were speaking at this event. Bachmann, Santorum, Perry, and Gingrich. Do you know who they are? Michelle Bachmann was a congresswoman. Rick Santorum had been a senator. Governor Perry of Texas, and then Newt Gingrich used to be Speaker of the House. And I introduced myself, told them I'm in tonight's film, gave them a copy of my DVDs, Conceived and Raped, From Worthless to Priceless, and Except in Cases of Rape, 12 Stories of Survival. And my business card, Conceived and Raped, Targeted for Abortion. And I told them I'm the national spokeswoman for personhood. And right away, Bachmann and Santorum said, oh, I signed the personhood pledge. I said, yes, I know, thank you so much. 2 days earlier it came out, they signed it immediately. It was a no exceptions, no compromise pledge. But Governor Perry and Newt Gingrich had not signed it because they were both rape exception candidates. And so I gave all this to Governor Perry, and right away he was stunned. He asked, this is your story? And I shared with him how I was conceived and almost aborted. And then he asked me, can I have your autograph? no. And then he said, no, I mean it. And he gives me a marker and says, make it out to my daughter. So I wrote 100% pro-life, Rebecca Kiessling. And then he asked me more questions, and I shared with him about some of what I do. I have a network of hundreds with these stories. I mentor others, train others to do speaking. I testified before legislatures. As an attorney, I litigated numerous high-profile cases defending human life. I speak about 75 times a year around the country and overseas. And he said to me, you know, you're my heroine. Like, wow, thank you so much. But it's funny you say that, because my question for you is, would you be my hero? And I shared with him what I shared with you, that I'm alive today because of legislators who were 100% pro-life, no exceptions, no compromise, who are my heroes. They protected me. And I asked him again, would you be my hero too? And he said, yes, I would. But you make that rape exception. And he put his head down and shaking his head saying, wow, this is so powerful. This is so powerful. And he was thinking about it. I didn't know how much time I had. Other people were waiting. I said, I wanted to get my picture taken with you, but my battery's dead. He said, well, I'm my own personal photographer. Come with me. And so we went to his green room where we took tons of pictures, which they have never sent me. But he kept looking at the pictures saying, I just can't imagine. I just can't imagine. And I looked up at him and I explained that when you make that rape exception, that's like saying to me that I deserved the death penalty for the crimes of my father. The United States Supreme Court said that he didn't even deserve the death penalty. And in another case, they said that even for child molesters, that it's cruel and unusual punishment. He was nodding his head. I asked him, but you believe that I, the innocent child, deserved the death penalty? And he said, no, I don't. Well, and he stopped me. He said, you know, tonight's event and this film are supposed to be all about changing hearts and minds. And right now, you're changing my heart. And I thought, changing? What's that supposed to mean? And I had all kinds of friends on Facebook saying they were praying for me, saying, you're going to have an Esther moment. I just know it. You're going to have an Esther moment for such a time as this. And I was not about to miss it. So I challenged him. No more rape exceptions. And he looked me in the eyes and he promised no more rape exceptions. And I thought, yes. He went on to say that he had just never put a face to the issue before. He had never considered it from the perspective of someone like me. He's the governor of Texas running for president. You think he's never heard the arguments before? But again, it goes to show what a story can do to pierce the heart in ways in which arguments cannot. The next morning, he signed the personhood pledge, and so did Newt Gingrich. And he went on national television 4 times talking about our conversation, how my story pierced his heart, saying he could not look me in the eyes and justify the rape exception any longer. He didn't get attacked for saying that because he didn't say anything stupid. There was a real woman behind this story, so the media left him alone. He went back and transformed his state. 9 months before meeting him, they had a rape exception in a sonogram bill. It didn't even say a woman had to view the ultrasound of her baby before aborting. It just said she had to be told she had the opportunity. But they added a rape exception? Like, it was so ridiculous to suggest that a rape victim would want to view the rapist baby. I mean, they couldn't even protect us in such an innocuous bill like that. Well, ever since then, Texas has passed some of the most stringent laws in the country, and it didn't even make it out of committee with the rape exception in it. And now, last year, all of their gubernatorial candidates and candidates for lieutenant governor, like 5 in each of those races, every single one of them was 100% pro-life, no exceptions. And so if you can change the heart of a governor during a presidential campaign, let me tell you, you can change the heart of anyone. Do not be afraid to stand up and speak out, especially when you go off to college. You may think that you're in the minority, but let me tell you, there's a silent majority who's afraid to speak up. Do not be afraid. Challenge your professors. Speak up. Well, one last story is on my birthday, almost 2 years ago, my birth mother called to wish me happy birthday and to tell me that my grandma died on my birthday. I was born on her anniversary, and she died on my birthday. And we had a long heart-to-heart. We had both been to visit her together recently. I made her laugh because I sang, and God gave me a gift of voice for speaking only. And, we had a nice time together. And at the end of this long conversation of my birth mother, we were about to hang up, and she stopped me. And she said, Rebecca, I just want to say, I'm so glad I had you. Oh, that was the best birthday gift ever. All these years after she sought to kill me, all these years after she maintained it should have been my right, years later, she's able to say, I'm so glad I had you. Let me tell you, when you get involved in this issue, and you begin to volunteer at pregnancy centers or pray outside of abortion clinics or take any kind of a stand, just know that there will be mothers in your community who will be able to say to their children, I'm so glad I had you because of what you've done. Thank you.